Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Blickstein. I have been teaching a history of Jewish immigration to the United States for the last few weeks. Unfortunately, our final session, session 4 last week, I forgot to hit the record button. So I'm taking the time this afternoon to re-record, to redo the session for those of you who missed it. So let's go ahead and get started. Just give me a moment. The PowerPoint now, and let's get started. So before we go get started, just to review where we left off, last week we talked about, or the previous session, I should say, we talked about the Jews of Eastern Europe, the big wave that began in 1881, and what were the things that triggered it. And of course, the major point was that in 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. His son, Alexander III, became the new czar and immediately blamed the Jews. There was a kind of a terrorist organization that bombed the czar's carriage, and mistakenly one of the perpetrators was believed to be a Jew. Anyway, the new czar blamed the Jews and proceeded to enact a series of laws that basically took all the privileges away. I don't want to, you can go look at your handout from session 3. But the big thing that happened was the pogroms. And there were a series of them starting immediately in 1881, another series that began in 1903. And the pogroms were the pogroms and the economic hardships caused by the new laws were really what triggered this massive wave of Jewish immigration. 90% of us, of Jewish Americans, can trace at least some of our ancestry to that particular period of time. Of course, in my case, it's all of it. Anyway, to pick up where we left off, we talked about how the Jews, how they got to America, the ships, the major ports they sailed from. And I want to pick up today, and we talked about what it was like to be in steerage class as you crossed the ocean to come to America. And we'll pick up today with what happens when the Jews arrive and what's life like, and what eventually the laws that changed that brought this wave of Jewish immigration to, if not a halt, pretty much, almost did away with it. So we'll talk about that in a little while. All right, so let's start with, before we get started, actually, I want to recommend a few books. These are all referenced to your handout. If you're interested in knowing more about this, I certainly found these books very enlightening, gave me a lot of insight into what life was like for my grandparents when they arrived in America. So the first one is a book called The Promised Land by Mary Anton. She was an immigrant child, a child when she came, and I believe her family settled in Boston. I have the book. I just forgot to double check, but I believe it was Boston. But nonetheless, it's a fascinating book about her experiences coming to America and what life was like. So again, a lot of insight. The second one, very similar, but this was somebody who grew up on, as it said, on the Lower East Side, which was New York City. Rose Cohn's Out of the Shadow, also written in that time period. So she's writing it as a young adult, looking back on her experiences. The third book, a wonderful one, actually, this one was from the New York City, the Tenement Museum, which I'll mention in a little while. But this, obviously, Lawrence Epstein's book, The Story of the Jewish Immigrants on New York City's Lower East Side, which 75% of the Jews that came to New York, that arrived in New York, stayed in New York. So a lot of them, and the major point where they settled was the Lower East Side, which I'll show you a map of in a minute. And then the final one I want to mention is Hasia Diner's book. She's a professor at NYU. This is her field, really Jewish history, She talks a lot about immigrant experiences, and this particular one is called Lower East Side Memories, a Jewish Place in America. So she's you see a lot of her videos on YouTube. She's been like scholar in residence quite a bit. She would be wonderful to have at Mikveh Israel. But anyway, she's a terrific author and scholar, and so I recommend her books. This is one of a number that she's written, and about the different experiences. Anyway, the only thing I want to mention before we get started, and there's a parallel that we'll see a little bit later, and that is Italian immigration to the U.S. Most of the Italians who came to America came in the same time period as the Jews came. In fact, they lived you'll see a map soon. Little Italy was really right next to the Lower East Side where the Jewish people settled. And most of them, just like most of the Jews came from Eastern Europe, most, but not all of them, came from Southern Italy, primarily Sicily, which is a separate island, Naples and the area kind of around Naples, and then Calabria, which is one of the southern like provinces, I think they're called, or I'm not sure, but like a state, if you will. Um, there's a name for them. I can't remember if it's what it is in Italian. But anyway, their experience was a little different from the Jews in that they came from primarily economic reasons, but also political. There were economic hardships that came about when Italy unified. Up until I think it was 1861, Italy was a series of kingdoms and perhaps principalities, if you will. And once Italy, became a country, much like we saw with Germany, it created a lot of problems. So most of the Italians who came weren't planning to stay here permanently. They came hoping to make a living, to earn some money, and then go back to Italy. So in the beginning, they didn't really bring their families. Of course, a lot of things changed, and many of them did stay, or they went back and brought their families back with them. But again, you'll see a little bit later why I wanted to point this out to you. So again, think about these Italian immigrants, mostly Catholic, primarily, I mean, I don't know what percentage, but almost overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, coming into the United States, which was up until this period of time, predominantly Protestant. So we'll see how things change a few years later. All right, so when immigrants first arrived in the US, if they came into New York, which most of them did, I'm talking about the Jewish immigrants, they would, after 1855, they would come into a place called Castle Garden. Today, Castle Garden is at Battery Park. Well, it was always at Battery Park, but today you can actually visit it. It's a national monument. Up until 1855, any passengers arriving in the port of New York or immigrants just got off the ship, whatever wharf their boat landed, and just walked into Manhattan. There was no processing center per se. And they weren't even recorded on passenger arrival lists until 1820. So, pretty early on, but we were a new country and we were welcoming everyone who wanted to come. So the majority of Eastern European Jewish immigrants entered the US through the port of New York. But also many of them, a number of them, came into Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So those were the other three, but primarily New York City was the major one. Okay, so let's see what happens. And just talk a bit about Castle Garden. 8 million immigrants came through here in that, 35-year period. And once it closed in 1890. Ellis Island opened in 1892. So in the interim, they went through a barge office. But as I mentioned today, it's a national monument that you can visit. And it's right next to the where you catch the ferry to go to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. So if you're in New York and you decide to go to Ellis Island, you can also visit Castle Clinton, as it's called today. Okay, so I wanted to mention this. Who regulates immigration? Who regulated in that time period? In the late 19th century, before the late 19th century, immigration was regulated by each state. So the federal government had nothing to do with it. Late in the 19th century is when it changed to federal. So the Immigration Act of 1882 became the first actual immigration law in US history. And then the one in 1895, just a few years later, further solidified federal control over immigration, which we now know is how it is today. So these were some, the Office of Immigration, the Bureau of Immigration. The Office of Immigration was part of the Treasury Department for many, many years. I don't want to belabor that, but as I say, it wasn't federal responsibility until the 1880s. All right, so let's talk about Ellis Island, which from probably many of us, our grandparents, great-grandparents, parents perhaps, whoever, came through Ellis Island. As I mentioned earlier, it opened in 1882. And 1892, excuse me. The reason it was opened was that the U.S. realized that there was such a huge number of immigrants coming in, with all the Jews coming in, with all the Italians, and of course many others. But those were the two predominant groups of immigrants coming in. So it had to, Castle Garden could no longer handle the massive number of people. So the Ellis Island was opened, and it was the processing point. And this, I want to emphasize this, for all immigrants traveling in steerage. And the original building, that's a picture of it there. I think we got it together now. All right, so that's a picture of the original Ellis Island building. It was a little island just off the mainland in New York Harbor. And as I said, all the steerage passengers, but the original building was made of wood, and it was destroyed by a fire back in 18, I'm sorry, yeah, that's a typo, I should have corrected. It was 1897, not 1987. All right, it was destroyed in 1897. And for the short time period when it was after it was destroyed by fire, they went back to using Castle Garden again for a couple of years. And then finally in 1900, it was rebuilt, this time much larger, and also it was made of brick. And the main thing was it had to be fireproof. They learned their lesson very quickly with the other building. So this is the new building. And just to share with you, today you can visit Ellis Island. It's now called the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration. That's an aerial view of it's actually two little sections now. A lot of it was filled in to make room for this. But you can see the main up here, I'll point it out to you. This is the main building here. And then these are some of the outbuildings, including some of the buildings where immigrants, where the hospital immigrants who had illnesses would be housed here until they could be released, until they healed. So that's, and then here's another shot of the entrance. And I'm sure a number of you have been there already. If you haven't, it's a wonderful place to visit. I've been there at least twice, going back. I think the first time was in probably 2000. In fact, it was 2001. Anyway, it was 2001. And I've been there yet. As I say, I was there again. Okay, so here's a map just showing you how you get there. So here's the lower tip of Manhattan, actually where kind of the area where the World Trade Centers used to be. And you can either get the ferry here by the Castle Clinton National Monument in Battery Park, which is, as I say, the tip of Manhattan, or there's another ferry going from the railroad station in New Jersey in Liberty State Park. So again, two possibilities. I'm pretty sure I put this map into your handout. So again, the ferry from New York goes to both the Statue of Liberty and to Ellis Island. So you can do both with one trip. So again, just to reiterate the main points, the ships actually land, they land at Manhattan at the dock, but then only the steerage class people are taken over to Ellis Island because of the conditions in steerage, they wanted to make sure there were no health issues coming into the US. Interestingly enough, just to share a personal story, my great-grandmother, my mother's father's mother, that's the family I think I showed you last week, the Kisselovs, and how they came in. And the mother and the three youngest children were the last to come over. The other five kids were already here. Now, the kids, they were adults by then. And they apparently sent enough money for their mother and the three remaining kids, to travel in second class rather than steerage. And the reason for that is presumably, if I remember correctly, my great-grandmother had tuberculosis, I believe, and they knew that if she came through Ellis Island, they wouldn't let her in. So by bringing her through, I'm not sure just how serious it was or what, or maybe she had gotten over it, whatever it was, she traveled second class so that she wouldn't have to go through the Ellis Island inspections. So just a personal note on that. And then again, they talked about being ferried over to Ellis Island. And just again, a few more pictures of them, passengers getting off the ferry, getting off the ship. All right, and they mentioned the inspection cards. That's an example of one. And that's one of the officers putting the inspection cards on the passengers. And here again, more pictures of the health examinations. And trachoma was a big one, the eye infection. That was a lot of what they were looking for was trachoma. Let me just have a note about that. Let's see what my note says. Oh, questionable candidates were forced to submit to more detailed questioning and medical exams. Any signs of contagious disease, poor physique, feeble-mindedness, or insanity can see an immigrant denied admittance on the grounds that they are likely to become a ward of the state. In later years, doctors at Ellis Island devised puzzles, and memory tests to ensure that immigrants were intelligent enough to find work. Excuse me. Predictable. New arrivals could face rejection if they were anarchists, had a criminal record, or showed signs of low moral character. Not sure how they determined that. Despite the many guidelines, the number of people denied entry was quite low. I think they mentioned 12 million people, only 2% were denied entry. So, okay. All right, some of these pictures I think were included on the video, but again, just to reiterate, and I mentioned the mental test. I think that was the slide, the notes I was just. And the interpreters, interesting thing I learned about the interpreters and how important they were. But one of the people who was an interpreter, they not only needed strong linguistic skills in one or more foreign languages, they needed to convey the equivalent of the words and meanings expressed by the alien immigrant. So it was, and I, having been a volunteer translator or interpreter for a local medical clinic here on Hilton Head Island, sometimes knowing the language is one thing, but being able to interpret, in my case, it was a medical clinic. I didn't always know the vocabulary for different medical problems. So again, that could be a challenge as well. But one of the interesting things, many of the interpreters were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And the one I wanted to mention to you was Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York City for many years. While he was in law school, he spent 3 years on staff at Ellis Island between 1907 and 1910. He was the son of Italian immigrants and therefore was fluent in Italian and also, as well as Croatian and Yiddish. And he served as one of the island's translators while he, as I say, while he was going to law school at night. So just something, a little sort of note of interests on the side. Okay, and again, they showed you the picture of the Great Hall. Some of these are the same pictures you see in the video. So, and I mentioned this earlier, nearly 75% of the Jewish immigrants remained in New York City. Okay, since I'm re-recording this. All right, so let's talk about New York City and what went on there. I don't think there's a note on this, but so New York had the largest Jewish population in the United States. And in 1881, when this wave of immigration started, there were the estimate was about 80,000. I guess it was based on census records, but it was more than just an estimate, but 80,000 roughly Jewish people living in New York City. By 1901, it was 510,000. And by 1920, it was 1.5 million Jewish people living in New York City. So quite a big increase. And you can see this picture. If you've seen the movie, I'm sure you've seen the movie Funny Girl. I believe it was Hester's one. I forget the name of the street. It wasn't Hester's. Well, there is a movie called Hester Street. It's another one that's very telling about this period of time. But I forget what Henry Street was the one that Fanny Bryce lived on, where her mother's saloon was. So if you remember all the push carts and the crowded people, this is very much what the Lower East Side looked like in those days. All right, this is the map I mentioned to show you where the Lower East Side is. So here's Battery Park. Oops, sorry. Again, I did the same thing. Here's Battery Park down here. And the Lower East Side, not that far away, it was up in the, up here a little bit. And just again, to give you a perspective, this is the site where the World Trade Center would have been or was until 9/11. So this is it. And by the way, Little Italy was, as I said, was right next to it. And then I don't know if I, whoops, sorry, Chinatown was right below Little Italy. So again, all of the immigrant areas were very close. In fact, one of the reasons that they say that Jews are so, well, first of all, why did Mahjong become such an important game among Jews? And that is the proximity of Chinatown. I believe the story is they were introduced to Mahjong by seeing it played in Chinatown. And also this fondness for Chinese food. Again, we all know why do Jews eat Chinese food. It's one of the few on Christmas. It's one of the few restaurants that's open on Christmas Day. So this is, again, just to give you an idea of Lower Manhattan and the immigrant areas. Little Italy is still well, so is the Lower East Side. We'll talk more about that, but Little Italy still has a lot of Italian history, and there's a festival every year called the San Gennaro Festival. Some of you may have been to that. Again, that picks up on Italian culture. By the way, if you saw The Godfather, which I'm sure you did, the one that showed the early days, I guess Robert De Niro, I believe, was the actor who portrayed The Godfather. Anyway, that was all Little Italy where that scene was set. Okay, so again, here's another picture of New York's Lower East Side. And one more. So let's talk about how they found a place to live. So some of them arrived, and if they were lucky, they had some relatives to move in with. I know one of my grandfathers moved in with his brother. That was very typical. But a lot of them, if you saw Hester Street, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a wonderful movie to really tell you about this this period in our history, a lot of people became boarders in the apartments of strangers, especially while they were trying to save up some money to bring over their families. Rather than spend money on renting an apartment, they would just rent a room, a place to sleep with another family, and it was a good source of income for the family. But it also created very crowded conditions. So let's take a look at these tenement apartments. So by 1900, 2/3 of New York City's population, or roughly 2.3 million people, were living in tenement housing. What does that mean? These were very crowded. A lot of these buildings went up during this period just to accommodate the number of immigrants coming in. So what are the tenements? So there were multi-story buildings, as I said, to accommodate these immigrants. And they were crowded because they needed to kind of solve the housing problem. But with that came some very abysmal living conditions, very little natural light, not good ventilation. It wasn't the Ritz, let's put it that way. It wasn't high-end living. All right. But, and so, of course, with all the crowding, you had a lot of disease, and we'll talk about some other things. So this is sort of some pictures of what the tenements looked like. So this would be the rear where they would hang their laundry. And this is kind of they were built in close proximity to one another. I'll show you in a minute, but there were these little sort of open spaces between the buildings that you could get to from inside the building. And it's just a picture I found. So this is a kind of a floor plan, if you will, or a diagram showing how these things were built. So they were very narrow. As we said, 5 to 7 stories. The whole footprint of the building was maybe 25 by 100 feet. And that space would be, so that's what, 25 by 100, 2,500 square feet divided into 4 tiny apartments. So we're talking 600 square feet per apartment. Think about that. Think about your own homes right now. So this is typically what it looked like. So you would have a public hallway, and there'd be, this would be the fire escape. And I guess that was the rear of the building where the fire escapes were. And this would be the front. And so here were the 4 apartments, 1 over here, 2, 3, 4. This one happens to be divided with 2 bedrooms. This one is 1 bedroom. But again, and they didn't have a bathroom. They would have a bathroom in the hall that all 4 apartments would share. Right. So again, just imagine hard enough to share one bedroom, a one bathroom with your whole family, let alone with three other families who might have had boarders as well. So you would enter right here in the hallway, and then the bedrooms would be over here. So no, just very compact space. And I mentioned New York's Tenement Museum is a wonderful. If you haven't been there, it's a great place to visit, and they've taken some of these old buildings and set them up to look like the apartments would have looked in those days, and it's very interesting and very well done. So some pictures of these. Obviously, this was an old picture of an actual tenement apartment. You can see how many people were in the family. I'm guessing that would likely, I don't know if that would have been an Italian family. I'm not sure. I'm just guessing by that number of children, but I could be wrong. And again, the fire escapes were, dangerous. Look at these kids playing out on the fire escape. I wouldn't want my child out there. But this is how they managed to get fresh air, and this was their recreation, so to speak. And another pig is another one showing the kitchen. Again, these are old original photos. And then this one happens to be a photograph I believe I found on their website. This is actually from the Tenement Museum. So they've set up a series of apartments to look like what they would have looked like at the turn of the last century. And then I wanted to mention one of the things that, talk about living on the Lower East Side, for example. Settlement houses began to spring up, not very many of them. The famous one was the Henry Street settlement. And I mentioned Henry Street was where Fanny Brice lived. That's featured in the movie Funny Girl. But this is what it looked like on the outside, again, in one of the tenement buildings, probably. But inside, what did they do? So the Henry Street Settlement House was founded by a nurse by the name of Lillian Ward, 1893. And her goal was to provide free medical care to poor immigrants cramped in these tenements on the Lower East Side. And so she got other services. Other services would include English language classes. And also the Henry Street Settlement opened one of the earliest playgrounds in New York City so that these kids could have a safe place to play. So today the settlement house is still there. It became a national monument or listed on the National Register just a few years ago. And that's the plaque. So it says this house on Henry Street is dedicated to Lillian Wald, founder of the Henry Street Settlement, on the occasion of the centennial year. Okay. And that is a picture of the Henry Street Settlement House playground that I just mentioned. So that was one of the ways that immigrants, managed to acclimate or assimilate into American life. So here are some of the classrooms. Again, these are all historical photos I found online. All right, and there's one, this is not Henry Street Settlement House, but another one where you can see free classes in English. So there were a lot of services offered to immigrants, and many of them were charitable organizations that were funded by some of the longer standing immigrant families, particularly German immigrants who'd been here for a number of years and were more assimilated. Maybe it was grandchildren of some of those earlier immigrants. And in many cases, they were the ones providing these services, particularly if it was a free class, free classes. So, all right, no questions. All right, so how did immigrants earn a living on the Lower East Side, or for that matter, anywhere in America, this group of immigrants? So these were the occupations most of them had, or these were the most common ones in Eastern Europe for Jewish. Remember, they really were limited in going to places like medical school. Things we would take for granted today weren't available to the Jewish immigrant, to the Jews in Eastern Europe. So they were rabbis, they were what we call artisans. One of my grandfathers was a watchmaker, the other one was a tailor, and that's what they did when they got to America. So these were their furriers, cobblers, and all that, bakers. Now, what did they do? What kind of work could they do in New York City? And we'll talk about that. So they could become peddlers, which a lot of the push carts you would see on the streets were peddlers. Many of them became garment workers, and that was a fairly new industry in the sense that most clothing up until that point, most of it was custom made. You'd go to a dressmaker or to a tailor shop and they would make your clothes for you. The whole concept of ready-to-wear clothing really started in this era with all the immigrants that were available and the sweatshops that were opening. I'll talk about those in a minute, to make what we call ready-to-wear clothing, which is today you go into a shop or a department store and there are all the racks with all the clothes. Well, that wasn't the case back then until this point in time. So many of the Jewish immigrants became garment workers. That was one of the big industries in New York City. I guess up until recently, it still was. I would say recently, the last 30, 40 years. And we started bringing things in from China and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about the sweatshops. That was a big part of life in New York City, especially for Jews. So the sweatshops could either be factories like the top picture, or many of the sweatshops were in people's apartments where they would have, the one room in the apartment would become a sweatshop during the day where you had a lot of people sitting making garments. They would bring home the material, the fabric or the cuttings from the factory and do the work at home. They called it piecework, and they got paid by how many pieces they were able to, turn back in a day or two later, whatever it was. So this is and then something I wanted to mention, became the big industry. And one grandmother used to talk about this a lot, was something called the shirtwaists. She called it a blouse factory, but this is what it was. It was the new fashion trend for women in the early 1900s. They're called shirtwaists. Instead of wearing one-piece dresses, and if you've seen the series The Gilded Age, the women were all wearing dresses. Now they began wearing separates, what we call them today. And it was a shirt and skirt combination. And so many of the shirtwaists were made in the sweatshops on the Lower East Side. The women were frequently sexually harassed or assaulted by bosses or other male workers. There were almost no safety regulations. They were paid much less than their male counterparts. And the largest group of workers in these factories were Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant Jewish women. So again, big piece. My grandmother used to talk about working in the sweatshop and what that was like. So let's keep going. All right, it's another picture. You can see abolish slavery, or this one's in Hebrew, probably Yiddish, but Hebrew letters. All right, so let's talk about the labor movement, because out of these sweatshops grew what we know today as unions, labor movement. And really, the Eastern European Jews were the ones largely responsible for the development of the whole labor movement. So let's kind of go back a little bit, going back to Russia. The socialist rhetoric started in the 1890s, ultimately would lead to the the Bolshevik Revolution that overthrew the czars. But the whole movement started in the 1980s. It was 1917 when they finally were able to overthrow the czars. But the two pictures is Lenin, whom I've heard of, and Leon Trotsky. Last time when I did this the other day, I said Tolstoy. It was Leon Trotsky was the other, and he happened to be Jewish. But these were two of the big, what we call them today, influencers that began the labor movement, the socialist labor movement in Russia. And the whole idea was a struggle for the rights of workers and peasants. And there was a big push for unions for workers. And so many of the Jewish immigrants who came from Eastern Europe brought these workers' rights with them to America. And I know one of my grandfather, I may have mentioned this, my mother's father he was a big, I guess I would call him a socialist today. But he used to tell me that if he'd known that they were going to, the Bolsheviks were going to take over his country, Russia, he wouldn't have left. I doubt that, but nonetheless, that was how he felt. So not uncommon in those days for the socialist movement or socialist teachings to be very popular. And again, it spread throughout the Jewish in the Lower East Side. So the formation of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union happened in New York City in 1900. And those of you may recall, up until we really started bringing in most of our clothes from Southeast Asia or from China primarily, like Korea, whatever, Vietnam today, Um, the clothing that was made in New York, in the United States, rather, all had the Union label. In fact, there was a little jingle, "Look for the Union label." And the idea was you'd have a little label in your clothes that said ILGWU. Anyway, this was founded in 1900, and its members were primarily Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. And their goal as a group was to, of course, improve working conditions in the garment factories. So it was called the Ladies Garment Workers Union. Okay, so what happens? It was founded in 1900. 1909, there was a huge labor strike involving Jewish women working in those shirtwaist factories. And I want to share something with you. This picture is a woman named Clara Lemlich. And up to that, it was the largest strike by American female workers up to that date. And it was led by Clara Lemlich, who I'll tell you about in a minute, in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She was a Jewish immigrant who left Russia in 1903 after the Kishinev pogrom, which I talked about last week or last session, and she was a committed socialist. So, okay, November 22nd, 1909 is when this started. There was a big meeting. The ILGWU had a big meeting at Cooper Union. Some of you may know that was a college in New York City. And Samuel Gompers, who was one of the leaders, spoke, as well as other male union leaders. And all of them spoke of the need for patience and negotiation until Clara Lemlich, this Jewish immigrant who had only been here a short time, she came in 1903. This is now 1909. So 6 years, not that short time. Anyway, she jumped up on the stage, and this is a quote. She said, "I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those striking against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in generalities. What we are here for is to decide whether or not to strike. I make a motion that we go out in a general strike." And following that, her getting up there, I'm not sure I gave it the right emphasis, but I tried. What happened is this uprising. There's a picture of the meeting in Cooper Union. And there are these girls who are, yes, we're going out on strike. And that happens to be a picture of my grandmother, because she would describe something. She never called it the uprising of 20,000. This is what it's come to be called. But she would describe this event. And when I read about this the first time, I thought this is exactly what she was talking about. She was talking about leaflets and how they all went out en masse. And, she had come in 1907 and she was working in a sweatshop. She told me she was a forelady. That's what she always used to say, which I guess would be like a foreman. Be that as it may, she went out on strike with all these other women. And the end result, so approximately 20,000 out of 32,000 workers in the shirtwaist trade walked out in the next 2 days after Clara Lemlich's speech. They walked the picket lines despite frequent beatings, arrests, and a rapidly diminishing strike fund. Smaller workshops started to give in to their demands, but many of the larger companies, and I'll mention one because I'm going to talk about it in a minute, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, would not capitulate. They hired scabs as well as thugs to attack the women in the streets. They paid off judges to put the women in rough jails, while similar strikes by men had yielded only half a dozen arrests in total. So the women were just really victimized through this. But one of the most remarkable things that came from that strike is the previously unheard of support across class lines. A number of New York's upper class grand dames, such as Alva Belmont and J.P. Morgan's daughter, Anne Morgan, contributed considerable time, resources, and support to the strike. I know I saw a movie about this, and it seemed like they would bring food or water or just different things to give them support or be marching the picket lines with them. So that was very interesting. All right, so the strike started in November, and it ended on February 15th, 1910. So roughly 3 months, almost 3 months. Out of 353 companies, 339 of them in other words, most of them, agreed to most of the strikers' terms. And as I mentioned, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was one of the exceptions. So as a result of this walkout, they got better pay, shorter hours, and equal treatment of workers who were in the union and those who were not. And the shirtwaist workers proved that women can be a formidable force for the union. Proved to the union. So anyway, that was A. All right, so let's talk about the triangle fact, because something happened there that was quite historic and sad. So this is, again, just a few pictures of the from the uprising. Found these online. And then this is a picture of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So it was a rather large, to see if I have any other note. That was it. Okay. This is a large factory where they made these blouses, shirtwaists. And it was, again, in the lower Manhattan. And on March 25th, 1911, so a year after the strike had settled, there was a fire in the factory. And the fire, sadly, you can see some of there were steel doors that were used to lock the workers in to prevent them from taking breaks. And as a result, if a woman wanted to take a break, like to go to the bathroom even, she would have to get permission from her supervisor just to use the restroom. So these doors were kept locked, and suddenly there's a fire, and everybody's trying to get out. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute, I hope. All right, so this is the shirtwaist. Oops. Well, I'm not sure I can get to the video now. Let's see if I can. I'm going to pause and going to see if I can get you the video again. So now it's not coming up. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I can't seem to locate the video, and this will go on all night if I let it. So, just to suffice it to say, there were, I forget what the number was, the number of women who died as a result, but everybody was trying to get out of take the elevator down if they could. After just a few trips, the elevator broke down. The fire spread so quickly, and the women were jumping out of the building, and many of them just leaped out to their death because they were up on the 7th, 8th floors. The owners who were up on the top floor were able to get, didn't even worry about the women, the workers, and they happened to be 2 Jewish men who were the owners. They were able to get out by going up to the roof and then crossing over to another building and somehow getting out that way. But I think it was, I forget the number, it's something like 100 and some odd women died as a result of this fire. What I wanted, I don't know where all my slides disappeared to. Anyway, as a result, there were a lot of labor laws that changed, and workplace safety laws, I should say, that changed. Let me get to this. I'm sorry. Okay. A lot of the labor laws, or I guess what would today be overseen by OSHA, the Occupational Hazard Safety Administration, I think is what it stands for. Anyway, this had a big impact. It was up until 9/11. This was the worst workplace disaster ever to happen in New York City, only to be superseded by 9/11, 90 years later, almost 90 years later. So very, very bad. And as I say, it led to a lot of changes and in how these garment factories were run. So it was a major event, and the predominant number of women who worked there were Jewish immigrant women. So anyway, that's the story there. I'll try to send you the link to the video. I don't know what happened, why it disappeared. Anyway, all right, I want to talk about something really important that happened. I think I'm recording. Yeah. So this is a major piece. We talked about this period of Jewish immigration starting in 1881 and ending in 1924. And this is the reason why we had suddenly immigration quotas came into effect. Let's talk about what happened. So the first time we as a nation, our government ever did anything to limit immigration. And this happened to be when the federal government took over the administration or overseeing immigration, and they decided to exclude Chinese. So there had been a previous law that had, or Page Act, a congressional law that had outlawed Chinese women. And in 1882, they outlawed all Chinese people coming into the United States. It's the first federal law that prohibited any, immigrants of an entire ethnic group or, entire people. All right, so that was our first law, 1882. Now what happens? All right, so specific ethnic or national group from immigrating. See where we are today. All right, I don't want to go to where we are today. There was just a new announcement today, happens to be November 28th, and there was just an announcement that immigration from 19 third world countries is going to come to a screeching halt. So things continue much as they were. But anyway, let's see what happened in the 1920s. All right, so I just want to share with you what's going on from 1891 to 1910, 20 critical years in the in kind of the origins of European immigrants. So now, instead of coming from Northern Europe, the majority are coming from Eastern and Southern European countries. So Russia and Austria-Hungary, mostly Jews. Italy, we talked about, and again, some other of the Slavic countries, the Balkan Peninsula, what's now Czechoslovakia, and Greece and Turkey also were sending a lot of immigrants were coming from Greece and Turkey in that period. All right, so all of a sudden there's this big rise in xenophobia, which is xenophobia, if you don't know the word, is fear of foreigners, basically. And we see it today. It's not any different. By the way, some of you from Mikveh Israel might have been in services about almost a year ago now. It was December of 2024. And I gave a talk, wanted to commemorate the 100th anniversary of this law that we're about to talk about. So some of you may have heard some of this before, and maybe a refresher. But anyway, probably a lot of you never heard this talk. Anyway, okay, just to give you an idea. So I created this chart so that you can get an idea. So this is what Jewish immigration looks like. So starting 1881, the first 8 years, 23,000 Jewish immigrants, an average per year during that time period. So percentage of total immigration, we're only about 4%. Still significant, but 4%. Okay, now we get to 1890 to 98, and now we've got the average number jumps up to 41,000 per year average, and we're now 11% of the total of all U.S. immigration. Not just in New York, but all immigration to any port, any immigrants coming into the United States. By the next few years, it jumps up to 54,000, so we're still at 11%. But again, average numbers increase greatly. 1903 to 1907 is when it peaks, and we have an average of 123,000. It more than doubles during that next 4-year period. And just to see what's going on, 1903 is when that second wave of pogroms started. And those were the ones, the first pogroms in 1881 to 84 were really about property destruction. But now when you got to 1903 to 1906, the pogroms were all about murder and killing. Murder and killing is the same thing. Murder and destruction of property. Rape was very common. It was all out, let's destroy the Jews. And so that's where the big increase comes after 1903. And now you're seeing the average, as I say, jumps up 2.5 times. And it continues up until World War I starts in 1914. So we're seeing, it slows down a little after 1907. Again, that wave of pogroms has slowed down. So it's, wrong direction. So we're down to 84,000. Now, 1915 to 19, which is, during World War I, it's very tiny. I mean, there's very little immigration. We're down to 13,000, and we still represent 6% of all immigrants coming in. And then after World War I is over, picks up again in 1920, and we're averaging again, we're 12% of immigration. But look what happens after 1924. We're down to 4% again. We're back where we were, but it's only 11,000 coming in. So take a look how, if this were an R or a bell curve, you can see where it peaks in 1900. I think 1907 actually was the year with the highest number of immigrants coming into America. And then it's slowed down a little, but that was the peak year, particularly for Jewish immigrants. It was one of my grandmothers came in 1907. I always remember it that way. Okay, so let's see what happens. Now, this is where anti-immigrant sentiment is beginning to rise in the US. And this is a political cartoon from 1903, which, as I said, was the year that a lot of immigrants, certainly Jewish immigrants, really increased. But remember, I talked about Italian immigrants as well. So what you see in this cartoon, obviously Uncle Sam, the danger of to American ideas and institutions. And it says riffraff immigration and all of these different ethnic groups. If you look closely, you can probably, I'm sure it's representing all of the ethnic, the national origin people we talked about. But it says the high tide of immigration, a national menace. And down here, you fine print that you cannot read. I will tell you what it says. All right, this is the quote. Immigration statistics and this is 1903. Immigration statistics for the past year show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants are now being supplanted by the criminals and outlaws of Europe. I challenge you to listen to the news and hear what's going on today. And if it doesn't, the rhetoric doesn't sound very similar. So it's all of these criminals and outlaws of Europe that are coming to our borders. So this was, as I say, a political cartoon. I think the magazine was called Judge, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, all right, just to give you an idea what the sentiment was like. So let me share with you what led up to the laws that were passed that really brought immigration to a halt. First of all, there was something called the Dillingham Commission, and it was a bipartisan committee that was started, in Congress, and it met from between 1907 and 1911. Again, that's the period, we just saw this huge increase in Jewish immigration and likewise Italian immigration and other areas. What happens? Senator William Dillingham from Vermont, that's the years he served in the Senate. He was the chair of this commission. That's why it was named that. And their conclusion after 4 years was that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe poses a serious threat to American society and culture and should be greatly reduced in the future. Now, remember, we were a Protestant, predominantly, overwhelmingly Protestant nation until suddenly this huge wave of not only Jewish immigration, but Italian immigration comes in. All right, big. I think combined, we were about a third of all the immigrants coming in were either Jewish or Italian. So one of the things they recommended was that Congress enact a literacy test. So this would hopefully restrict undesirable immigrants from coming in. And their findings become the basis of the U.S. immigration laws that were passed in the 1920s. So what happens? Okay, World War I happens, and the Dillingham Commission was over in 1911. World War I breaks out in 1914. Immigration halts just because of the war. It's like a trickle for those few years. And then here's what happens after World War I, 1918. There's a rise of anti-immigration sentiment in the U.S. because Europe found itself in an economic depression. And there was a kind of a pent-up demand for people to come to America because it really hadn't happened during the war. There were 25 million desperate Europeans who wanted to come to the United States. Some of it was from the Red Scare. They were afraid of Bolshevism, which had just come to Russia. Remember, the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, where the Tsar was overthrown. So that was scary. And so the whole idea of restricting immigration became a very hot political issue. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar, right? Okay, so what happens? There's Representative Albert Johnson, who's a congressman, not a senator, he's a congressman from the state of Washington. And those are the years he served. And he became interested in something called, he was the minority member of the House Immigration Committee between 1913 and 1918. Well, during World War, he became its chair in 1919. Actually, it was right after he got into Congress that he became a member of the committee. And he had been pursuing a study of something of different racist ideologies, including something called eugenics, which was a movement aimed at proving the genetic composition of the human race. That's what eugenics is. The idea that now repudiated by science that among Homo sapiens, or humans, there are superior and inferior genetic types. Sounds like Adolf Hitler, right? Which is what it was. So anyway, he began studying this, and he called, this is his campaign speech, the greatest menace to the Republic today is the open door it affords to the ignorant hordes from Eastern and Southern Europe whose lawlessness flourishes and civilization is ebbing into barbarism. That's part of his one of his campaign speeches. So again, Southern and Eastern Europe. Who is he talking about? Primarily Italians and Jews. Okay, so now this is where it begins, the restrictions on immigration. So Representative Johnson proposes a 2-year ban on all immigration. The bill fails in Congress, but Senator Dillingham introduced another bill in the Senate, and he proposes setting an annual quota on new immigrants at 5% of the number of foreign-born of each nationality in the U.S. as of the 1910 census. So let me kind of clarify that. And you look at the 1910 census, and you're saying that the number of, so the census, would talk about where you were born, counting people, but not only were you, where were you born? Were you a U.S. citizen? All of that. And he wanted to go back to, this is now 1921, to go back to 1910 and say, okay, let's say in 1910, there were 100,000 people from Germany. I'm just making up a number. 100,000 number of people who were born in Germany living in the United States that year as of that census. So that would mean that 5,000 Germans could come in to the US each year. As I said, I'm just making up a number, but that was the idea. Go back to the census, how many foreign-born from each nationality. And what they would do, there was no Poland. Remember, Poland didn't exist in 1910, didn't exist as a state. So they went back and they sort of re-estimate. They looked at where people came from and said, okay, well, that was Russia then, but now it's Poland. So we're going to give Poland a quota as well, based on where those immigrants came from. So they kind of did some adjusting based on the new borders that were drawn at the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so 5% 1910 census. Okay, now think about 1910 census. That was sort of, we had a lot of Jews and Italians already here at that point. So keep that in mind. All right, and he wanted to limit, his proposal said, let's limit immigrants maximum number to 600,000 per year. And the quotas will be adjusted accordingly. All right. So the bill went through several iterations. And finally, the bill that was signed in 1920, President Harding signed it, was a 1-year measure. And what it did, it set the annual quota instead of 5%, it was set as 3% of the number of foreign-born from each nationality. And it said, instead of 600,000, let's limit new immigrants to 355,000 per year. I mean, what does that do? We saw how many, at one point there were 123,000 Jews, an average of 123,000 Jews coming in. every year between 1903 and 1907. Now you're saying 355,000 total of all nationalities. So again, it's really cutting back on immigration. And then it gets worse. All right, so now Congress reauthorizes the law 1921, 22, 23. And then they pass a new act, which becomes the permanent. Each one of these was just good for 1 year, renewable. Now it comes to 1924, and they pass something called the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924. And we said who were the Johnson we talked about. All right, so it revised the federal law, and it sets new quotas that are meant to be permanent. And I believe these stayed in effect until, I want to say 1965, somewhere in the mid 60s, these quotas remained, and that's important. Okay, so now they reset the quota for any nationality to 2%, and they made it retroactive to the 1890 census. So if you go between 1890 and 1910, that was the big wave of Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants coming into the United States. By setting it back to 1890, when the immigration was still from Eastern Europe particularly, was just a trickle, and giving it 2%, you were just basically making it impossible for Jews to come into the United States. I mean, literally got it down to just a handful, basically. Okay, 2% of foreign born in the 1890 census. Sad, very sad, and particularly in light of what's to come in the 1930s. All right, so again, the whole point was to decrease the immigration of religious groups by restricting Italians, Poles, Jews, and Greeks. Greeks were Greek Orthodox, so that was another non-Protestant group. And of course, the Poles were either Jewish or Catholic. So again, this was the whole idea of these laws. No question what it was about. All right, so as a result, 85% of the whole quota allotment will now go to Northern Europeans. 85%. So knocks out, those groups. And Poland is still Northern Europe, but it's considered Eastern Europe. Okay, so what happens? As I said, it comes down to a trickle. And I think I did say this. It was replaced by another act in 1965. Now, there was an exception to those quotas that I'll talk about in a minute. But by and large, this is what happens. So let's talk about what happens after 1924. Well, now we've got 100,000 Jews total in that 20-year period. 100,000 Jews arrived before and during the Holocaust. Think if we hadn't passed those laws in 1924, Congress hadn't, how many more people we might have saved from what was coming with Hitler in the 1930s and 40s. Very tragic to think about. All right, and then after the war, between 45 and 60, largely due to some laws that were, or decrees passed by Harry Truman, 250,000 Holocaust survivors came to the U.S. And then after 1960, most of the Jews who were arriving were coming from the Soviet Union, from Iran, and some other places. But largely a lot of Soviet Jews. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so here's what happens. Hitler, I don't want to talk about the Holocaust too much, but Hitler obviously becomes chancellor. Jews are suddenly boycotted and removed from positions in college, universities, and so forth. And the Nuremberg laws passed in 1935 take effect. If you saw the new movie Nuremberg, they talked very much about what happened to Jewish citizenship away from Jews. Jews in Germany, at least at this point, still only limited to Germany, realize it's time to go, but where can they go? So some German Jews tried to go to Palestine, but the British, who were in charge of it wasn't Israel yet, and that didn't happen until 1948. It was I guess a protectorate, I think is the term, of the British. And I can't think of the word, but anyway, it was under British or overseeing it. And they were afraid of, they were in charge since the end of World War I. It was the Ottoman Empire before that. And Turkey was one of the losers in World War I. All right. So the British don't want to let them into Palestine. They don't want to upset the Arabs. So they restrict how many Jews can come into Palestine. Most German Jews set their sights on the US, but because of the 1924 quotas, German Jews cannot migrate en masse. During the 1930s, a total of 132,000 Germans are allowed to enter the US under the German national quota. The majority of these are Jewish refugees. Many of the Jews that came in were distinguished professionals and academics in Germany, but they had to resort to taking menial jobs in the US. For an example, Hans Morgenthau, who was an international politics expert, who will later teach at several American universities, first worked as an elevator operator after he arrived in 1937, despite having earned his PhD in Europe. So in total, Hitler drove out 43% of German, Jewish academics, German academics, 43%. Okay, so Jews who can get out will go to any country that will grant them a visa. I know somebody living here who was a child at the time. Her family was from Berlin. Her father, I forget what he was, some kind of professional. I don't remember what he did, but he learned to be a welder and was able to get a visa. I mean, they were willing to go anywhere. He got a visa from Colombia, South America. And they moved, he went over. And as soon as he had some money, he sent for the rest of his family. And they got out in early 1938, luckily just before Kristallnacht, a few months before that happened. So again, it wasn't exactly like his first choice, I'll go to Colombia, but it was any country. They would just go to all the different embassies and consulates to see where they could get a visa. So he managed to get over there and then send for his family. And they eventually came to the United States years later. Okay. Many of them were able to flee to other parts of Europe. But again, in some cases, some of them went to France or to the Netherlands. But guess what? All right. The Nazis came in there not long after. Anyway, I mentioned the Arabs, the British. So here, this is going on with Hitler and persecuting the Jews. Most Americans opposed any adjustments to the Johnson-Reed Act. And again, they feared that any immigrants, including those fleeing persecution, will compete for scarce jobs and burden public services in the midst of the Depression. Remember, that was still going on from 1929 till the start of World War II. Okay, so all right. So I mentioned this 132,000 Germans and mostly Jewish refugees. Okay. So Kristallnacht, you all know what that is, I believe. For those of you who don't, you can see it here. It was just this massive state-sponsored, if you will, government-sponsored attack on Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues all across Germany. Over 100 Jews were killed, many hundreds injured. 30,000 Jews were arrested. And I remember in Atlanta, the Jewish Federation sponsored a program commemorating Kristallnacht. Probably, I forget, I think must have been the 60th anniversary in 98. That's probably when it was. And there were a couple of people Holocaust survivors living in Atlanta who came and spoke about their experiences, what it was like on Kristallnacht. It was just a horrible, horrible experience. As I say, many of the Jews were jailed. All right, so they just destroyed shops and synagogues, and I don't want to believe. You want to know more about it if you've never heard of Kristallnacht, certainly worth Googling. Okay, so here's some pictures. A synagogue that was torched. And what did that do? It just increased the demand So more Jews than ever. There were some who said, "Oh, this will pass. Things, things will get better." They suddenly realize it's not going to get any better, and they're off to. They want to get somewhere else, but there are no countries willing to take them. All right, things are not looking good. So shortly after that, 9 months, 10 months later, November, September 1st of 39, World War II breaks out when Germany invades Poland. And I don't want to make this about World War II, but we know what happened to the Jews. All right, so I just want to mention this one. This is the tragedy of the SS St. Louis. Probably a lot of you have heard about this. There were a number of Jews who were wealthy enough, well off enough to get some money together and managed to get a place on this ship that was going to go to Havana, Cuba. And it left Germany, I guess, in 1939, arrived in Havana Harbor, and they wouldn't let them in. I mean, I have some notes here. They left Hamburg, sailing aboard a luxury cruise line, the SS St. Louis. They had purchased visas to enter Cuba, hoping to reach Cuba and then eventually come to the US. But instead, the ship arrived in Havana and they were turned away after buying all their visas. And no other nation would take them. So the ship was forced to go back to Europe. I forget where it probably returned to Hamburg. Anyway, most of the Jews were arrested and eventually most of them died. In fact, there was a movie about this called Voyage of the Damned. That's about the tragedy of the SS St. Louis. Again, one example of how Jews were just prevented from getting into any country. It was like they would go wherever they could, but they couldn't get in. So something else, and again, I don't want to belabor this one, but I always thought, FDR was always one of my heroes. I certainly had heard about him from my parents. And yes, we know in his administration, there were many good things that happened, like the Social Security program starting. But apparently he was not very good to the Jews. And the one book I did read, I don't remember if I read the FDR and the Jews, but The Abandonment of the Jews, a wonderful book. And I'm sure I included this in the handout, the reference to this book. Very much, you can see how the US government absolutely did nothing when they could have done so much to help bring more Jews in. They continue to live with the same quotas that were in place under the Johnson-Reed Act. So tragic. Again, a book worth reading, The Abandonment of the Jews. Anyway, and there's also a PBS series that came out 3 years ago. It was a Ken Burns, a lot of you know who Ken Burns is, called The U.S. and the Holocaust, and it's available on streaming. So I believe this, I know I put this in your handout as well. Okay, so then I mentioned Harry Truman. Now, 1945, this Gallup poll said only 5% of Americans were willing to accept more European immigrants than before the war. But Truman really basically opened up America's doors, but announcing the Truman Directive in December of 45. He only became president, I believe, in April. I think that's when FDR died. Anyway, Truman's first year in office, and he wants to do something to help all these survivors. I think when I showed you the numbers, it dramatically went up. So displaced persons, meaning most cases Holocaust survivors, will be granted priority for U.S. visas within the existing quota system. So that's how he was able to, help get a lot more Jews in than had been allowed previously. All right. So by 1948, there's still a lot of displaced Holocaust survivors in Europe. Some of them were children and who or members of our congregation, Mikveh Israel, that is, who either came to America sometime after this or whose parents were able to get into America. Maybe they were born here, but I know a couple of people come to mind right now, right at this moment. And so Truman pushed for additional legislation to grant, so again, by 1948, they passed the Displaced Persons Act, authorizing 200,000 to enter the US, although there were restrictions on where they could come from. But again, opening the doors finally again, these were people who survived, and we know that there were 6 million who didn't make it through. Very, very, as I say, I don't want to keep repeating, but every time I think about it, it just makes me so sad. Okay, so 1950, they increased it again, total of 400,000 plus displaced persons allowed in. All right, so again, this is the idea. And between 48 and 52, approximately 80,000 Jewish displaced persons could enter the US. All right. And so we're going to wrap up soon. Again, it's a lot of this, just to talk about the Soviet Jews coming to America. That didn't happen until the 60s to the 1980s. Anti-Semitism was on the rise in the Soviet Union. Although they weren't planning to annihilate the Jews, there was certainly a great bit of anti-Semitism. And they were trying to destroy Jewish identity. So they closed synagogues, they banned Jewish education. When I say Jewish, not education for Jews, but specifically Jewish education, like we would send our kids to Hebrew school or Sunday school, no longer allowed. And they did not allow Jews to leave, just like 100 years earlier, or 90 years earlier, whatever, when the czars wouldn't let Jews leave, the Soviets wouldn't let them leave. So Soviet Jews began to protest. And finally, by the end of the 60s, Jewish religious life in the Soviet Union had come to a standstill. I mean, they were so not allowed to practice. In fact, I've met some people who lived through that period and knew they were Jewish, but knew nothing about their Judaism because it had all been taken away from them. So they had to, when they knew they were Jews, but they didn't know what that meant. Basically, they didn't know anything about the practice of their religion because there were no synagogues. There was no Jewish education allowed. So finally, and you've probably heard the term refuseniks, because they were refused permission to emigrate. And there was a refusenik movement that started in the 70s. And one of the leaders pictured here, if you recognize it, was Natan Sharansky. And Vladimir Sleepek, I don't know if he's in that picture, I'm not sure, but I recognize Sharansky for sure. And so American Jewish support for Soviet Jewry really began big time. And I can remember going to protests and, trying to meetings and marches and so forth to get, Jews out of the Soviet Union. So finally, some more pictures. There's a picture of Sharansky again right here. Finally, they were allowed to leave the Soviet Union. So this is a visa. It's all written in Cyrillic, so I can't tell you what it says, but they were finally, because of strong international condemnation, they finally allowed the Soviets finally increase the number of people who could leave. So during if they could only 4,000 people left the USSR, the Soviet Union, between 60 and 70. Between 70 and 80, they were now allowing 250,000, 250,000 to leave. And so the earliest emigres headed to Israel, and Israel got a big boost in their population at this time. I mean, I forget what percentage it was, but maybe it was 1 million Jews came from the Soviet. I think it was something like 20% of their population at that point were Soviet emigres. And also by the mid 70s, the US had become the destination of choice for Soviet Jews. So between 1970 and 88, 126,000 Soviet Jews came to the US. And another 165,000 actually went to Israel. It was easier to get into Israel than to get into the US. But at least they got out. That was the good thing. All right, and then some pictures of Soviet Jews coming to America. And then finally, and this is, I don't know if any of you knew this, there was an area in Brooklyn, New York, at Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. In fact, Stuart and I visited there. I can't remember, probably around 2000. But this neighborhood of Brighton Beach had become so inundated with Soviet Jews. This is pictures from that era. All the signs are in Cyrillic. So it became Little Odessa, is what it was called. Over 200,000 former Soviet Jews were living in Brooklyn. So again, if it was the Lower East Side 100 years earlier, or 80 years earlier, now it's Little Odessa in Brooklyn, in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And then finally, the last real big group were the Persian Jews that came to America starting in the late 1970s. And why did they come? All right. So Jews had lived in Persia for 27, or in Iran for 2,700 years. I guess going back to Babylonia, if I'm getting it straight. And then the Pahlavi dynasty, which was the Shah, 1925 to 1979, were considered the golden age for Iranian Jewry. And he created an environment of social and religious tolerance for all of the non-Muslims living in Iran. So from a Jewish perspective, he was a good guy. But, and of course, they were thriving economically until we know what happened in 1979. Well, there began to be discrimination against Jews, and they were often mistreated or treated as second-class citizens. But they were, they kept silent about it. But finally, 1979, late 70s, Iran's Jewish population was about 100,000. 75% of them were in Tehran. And then by 1977, the opposition to the Shah begins to manifest itself. And Jews were seen as closely aligned with the Shah, and a wave of anti-Jewish sentiment breaks out. So the Islamic Revolution, which we all remember because it included something like they had taken prisoners of all the people that worked in the American embassy in Tehran, and Jimmy Carter was trying to negotiate to get them out. It was a big to-do. Finally, I guess Ronald Reagan finally made it happen, or they allowed it to happen under Reagan. But with the overthrow of the Shah, suddenly it's an Islamic regime. The Jews see that they have no future for themselves. 2/3 of them get out right away. They leave Iran. And I guess the Iranians were just as happy to have them leave. So, or the Muslim government anyway. So an estimated 35 to 40,000 Iranian Jews came to the United States during and after the Islamic Revolution. And there was already a large Iranian community in Los Angeles, so that's where most of the Iranian Jews chose to settle. Now, yes, there were pockets. I know Atlanta had a small Iranian Jewish or Persian. They called themselves Persian Jews. Yes, there was a small population in Atlanta, but the predominant place, just like the Lower East Side was for the Jews in the early in the turn of the last century, now they were going to Los Angeles. Some settled in New York. Anyway, this is the Jewish community today. Great Neck, New York, apparently has a large Iranian Jewish community, but Los Angeles was home to about 50,000 Jews, Iranian American Jews rather, and it became known as Tehrangeles. So we had Little Odessa in Brighton Beach. We have Tehrangeles in California, in Los Angeles. And that, my friends, is the end of what I had to tell you.